couple of bits of admin before we jump into the main session. So the first bit of admin is, let me just go to the next screen actually. That's the agenda coming up. I'm in the introduction section now. We are starting at 5 or a few minutes past that, but if you are coming or intend to come in person in future, we've actually made arrangements with the receptionist to stay on until 5:15. Okay, so that's something new. But we're just saying, please be on time because we don't want to make her have to stay longer and longer and longer. So in person, 5:15, and then the doors will be closed and you'll be stuck. Okay. Don't forget the in-person part is only on odd month events. So we're in July now, so that's an odd month. Next month is, yeah, correct. The next in-person online hybrid event is September. Okay, whereas August is going to be online only. Okay. We do also want to encourage people to be here in person. It's easier to network, it's easier to meet. But obviously, if you're out of town or stuck, you want to avoid the traffic, I guess it makes sense to be online. Obviously, we record the sessions as well, so that's fine. And then the last thing is we are looking for presenters for next month. It's it's a news flash. Let me actually get to that quickly. Here we've got a main topic. Okay, normally we might consider a workshop, but instead I'll be doing a BI flash. But next month is the item called news flashes, which means we'll be doing BI news as part of the event, and then BI flashes, which, just for those who don't know, a BI flash is just something short, 5 or 10 minutes, something that you've discovered recently that you think some other people might be interested in it. It doesn't have to be super fancy. Some people are a bit nervous. They think that their idea isn't suitable. Trust me, anything that you've struggled with and then figured out how to do, others would definitely enjoy learning from you. So it's normally 5 or 10 minutes. We would need 2 for next month. Stefan tells me he's got one, his colleague's got one. So we're looking for 1 BI Flash presenter, please. Please do let us know if you're keen. We do need a BI presenter, a Flash presenter. Okay. All right, excellent. So that basically is all the housekeeping done, except for just a little bit on Teams etiquette. Obviously, it's meant to be interactive, so we're happy if there's feedback and so on, but just whilst there's nothing to mention, just keep your microphones on mute, please. Stefan is going to monitor the chat if there are questions. And then last bit of admin for those in-house, there are drinks in the fridge over there, and then the bathrooms are just out there somewhere. You'll find them. Okay. All right. In which case, let's move on to the main topic. Brian, thank you for joining us. I know you're far away. You're in the UK. Brian Perris is joining us for the main presentation. The topic is artificial intelligence and the importance of data management. Very excited to hear more about that. I'm sure Brian will introduce himself, but just a quick rundown. He looks after enterprise sales at Click, and specifically for Sub-Saharan Africa. And he's a sales and marketing person with technical skills. So it's a great combination. Brian, we're delighted to have you with us. We love having international speakers. So we're, like I said, delighted, and hand it over to you. Thank you.
Okay, so thanks for the introduction. I won't sort of labour too much, but what I want to do is really give you quite a sort of a high level perception as to what we're seeing globally as an organisation. And I've been around long enough to see a lot of changes within the industry over the sort of 35 years that I've been in IT. So I'm sort of old enough to have seen, I used to work for Sun Microsystems to see the .com growth. I've been around to see big data. I've seen this migration to the cloud. So there's always change and there's always opportunity. But the interesting thing now is around AI. Now, obviously, everyone's talking about AI. You can't really have a conversation or you can't read anything without somebody mentioning AI. But to me, you know, there's the hype aspect and the interest aspect, but also there's the reality part of it. And I'm a little bit skeptical with many technology changes. But certainly what's happened now, if I'm having to sort of read and learn and understand AI, then this is getting serious. And I think it is serious to everybody. So I'm not going to do any product pitches. I don't want to mention products at all. I work for Click. I don't think I need to introduce Click as an organization. I think for most of you guys, you're either Click users or users of other data visualization or analytical platforms. But one thing that happened last year was that Click acquired Talend, and Talend was and is a data management platform. So what we have now as an organization is a lot more focus, not just from an analytical perspective, but in terms of effectively generating business benefits from data. That can be through visualization, it can be through forecasting, extrapolating, but more and more now decision making is moving to become near real time and real time. And obviously, when we look at the impact of decisions on data, it's moving away from being business critical to mission critical and now to life critical. So data is becoming, I hate to use the phrase, but it is the new oil, and it's the new oil because it's a commodity. And like oil, you have to refine it to create the value. And the same thing with data. And obviously you guys know more about this than I do. But there is definite change that's going on. And I think this is the key thing now. So for a lot of organizations, you sit back and you probably say, well, am I an early adopter? Do I wait to see what the maturity of the industry is? Everyone has a different strategy. But I think the worst strategy for most organizations is really the do nothing strategy. And the reason I say that is that, like everything, knowledge is one thing and experience is another. And AI isn't just a sort of an out of the box, LLM type scenario. So it's not just something that you would necessarily subscribe to as a service. And depending on your competency, depending on your creativity and your courage as an organization, through the building of algorithms and the deployment of algorithms, this is the sort of thing that will differentiate organizations. And like with every sort of technology change, it's normally the early adopters that come out on top. So I think it's a question of being scared, and I think it's a question of being optimistic, and it's a question of being excited. So this little deck is not around products. I'm just going to go through, and as I say, I try and give you a little bit of insight as to what we're seeing and some of the short-term and medium-term limitations of implementing AI technology right the way throughout the business. So just to move on then. So this is all around a new era, as I say. Things have changed, and I think this is more than a fad. If you believe in the Gartner hype curve, AI is definitely something that's here. Now, normally for the younger people in the audience, this isn't new to them. I was quite surprised that even 2 years ago, my son's an estate agent, and 2 years ago, he was telling me about ChatGPT. I have a pre-sales engineer that works with me. He's been working on OpenAI for probably 3 or 4 years. So the technology is not new. And when you look at AI, probably the most mature and obvious example of AI is driverless vehicles. So it wasn't so long ago that there was a lot of hype around this technology. Now it's sort of has gone quiet, but the reality is that it hasn't gone quiet because it's gone away. I think when we look at the utilization of driverless vehicles, this is now moving into maturity, and certainly in different parts of the world. I've seen it in the US, I see it in the UK now. It's not unusual to see driverless vehicles, be it mainly within restricted roads, so they tend to be driverless buses, driverless trams, etc., etc., etc. But this is just an example of AI in the real world. But as things roll out and as the confidence in the adoption of AI increases, then it comes back to the confidence that you have in the technology. But the key thing in all of this is the trust that you have in the data. So think about your data as your oil, as your commodity. And it's a little bit like, filling your car up. If you put the wrong type of petrol in, if you put diesel in a petrol engine, you're not going to get very far, and vice versa. So what we're seeing now is that people are on if you like, a decision-making process now that says, well, what do we do? Now, the interesting thing is, and what I'm hearing, and I'm starting to hear now, and this happened when big data and data became the hot subject. Certainly in the US, we saw this big adoption of chief information officer. And the good thing, the chief data officer, the key thing there is that data was recognized as being important enough as an asset to an organization that it needed almost an independent custodian. So from an IT perspective, obviously, technology and infrastructure is the key requirement that drives and underpins everything. But in terms of ownership, responsibility, and accountability of data, the role of chief data officer has grown, it's matured, but it's not in every organization. It's not for everybody. But that might just be a question of time. But the reason I mention it is that what we're starting to hear now, and whether or not it's going to have the same level of adoption, is the chief artificial intelligence officer. So already now, I think organizations are starting to recognize that they need to build expertise and competence on technology, particularly around AI. But some organizations have actually started to build their own AI platforms. And obviously the strength of AI primarily is within the algorithms. But like everything, and particularly everything that comes out of the US, it's normally on a scalable size. So the whole sort of drive and the motivation by the industry with all of the IT vendors is to dominate. This is the way that IT companies have always worked. Before Click, I used to work for Microsoft. I used to work for Oracle. I worked for Cisco. I worked for a number of companies. Why do I say this? Because you have to be a little bit careful, because there are, at a technology level, you go to the big IT vendors, but quite often their motivation is always to lock you into their technologies. And cloud was always a good example of that. But what we're seeing now is that obviously in previous times, the move to the cloud was normally justified, which is questionable in terms of cost savings, that it was cheaper to host data in a cloud environment. The industry was demanding more storage. Storage was expensive. But what's happened now is that the demand for compute is moving away from storage. And part of the reason is that when you look at AI isn't really necessarily that hungry for storage. It's not to say that lake houses and data lakes, et cetera, are not part of the requirements. But what's happening now within particularly AI processing is that the data that you're using is going to be real time, near real time. It's going to be not just structured data, it will be semi-structured, it will be unstructured. But the key thing is that the processing that you need to actually run your algorithms, to run your business decision-making processes, more and more now, the trend is saying, well, we need to bring compute closer to the source of data. So when you think about it, it doesn't make sense to move large volumes of data around the world to do a real-time analysis where probably 99% of the data is not being used, and the actual requirements for compute can be provided on a local basis. Now, obviously, different parts of the world have different appetites for cloud, still within Africa for different limitations. There's not a big adoption of public cloud. Private cloud is still around. But when we talk about things like data sovereignty, et cetera, there's still a preference for traditional on-prem or hybrid models. But obviously, when we talk about LLMs, when we talk about platforms for processing artificial intelligence, when you're going to products like ChatGPT, these are all being processed in the cloud. But more importantly, the source of the data that these LLMs are using is data that the system is trained on. And quite often that data that's being used is not your data. It's normally data that comes from third parties. And the other problem that you have currently with the versions of AI that's available now, you don't actually know where the source of that data came from. Now, on one side of it, what we're saying is, well, look, we need to build trust into the data itself. We need to build more automation into decision making. We need to be quicker in decision making. We need to be smarter. But the other thing that we have to be careful of is that there's a lot of bad data out there. There's a lot of fake data. There's a lot of dark data. And there's things like synthetic data as well, which has been created for a certain use and doesn't necessarily mean that that data is the right data for your modeling or your business decision making. So there's quite a few moving parts in all of this. So when I sort of look at what's going on now, it's a little bit of a perfect storm. It's not an easy thing for organizations to get to grips with because it's new to a lot of organizations. There's a lot of misinformation around, the same as everything else. Some people are much more advanced. Some people will prefer to do things in-house. But at the end of the day, the best solution for any organization is probably going to be some sort of hybrid. I mean, you do what's best for the business. But when you look at some of the forecasting, at a business level, what the prediction is, the companies that will come out on top, and it's a little bit like the sort of dot-com era, will be the ones that are the early adopters and the ones that effectively build competency and create competitive advantage through either the utilization of the various AI platforms and technologies that are available, or by building their own algorithms and creating their competitive advantage from this. So it's a new era. Things are definitely changing. Personally, I think this is not a fad. I think we all have to wake up and do some homework on this. Interestingly, when you talk to different people in organizations, it's not necessarily the most senior and most experienced people that have an appetite, excuse me, for this technology change. Quite often, because products like ChatGPT are available to everybody, it's a sort of individual person consumption. It's not an organizational product or strategy. A lot of people that aren't necessarily even from IT are already experimenting, they're already using AI, and they're trusting it, they're making decisions. In fact, there's been some quite interesting analysis of, using AI to write theses in terms of dissertations, et cetera, using real students and using AI. And the last one I read, it was actually AI that came in and beat all of the students hands down. But the more scary thing is the people that view and assess either manually or in an automated way to decide whether or not this document was produced by a real person or AI, they couldn't tell the difference. So it's going to affect everybody's lives. As I say, I mean, driverless vehicles was something that came up, was maybe seen a little bit gimmicky, but this hasn't gone away. This will continue. But I think the interesting thing is that when we look at organizations, what we're predicting is that the data that you need to support your business currently is normally structured data. When you look at traditional BI, which tends to be working only on your own data sets, quite often it's historic data. But the key thing now is that when we look at the requirement for particularly generative AI, which is ultimately what most people see as the first objective for them, now we're saying that it's actually the unstructured data is where you're going to create that value from. So when we talk about unstructured data, we're talking about data that's on the internet. It can be emails, it can be social media, it can be from documents, etc., etc., etc. And traditionally, this wasn't an area where you could create much value from. But now when we talk about unstructured data, when we're talking about semi-structured data, this is typically going to come from outside of the organization. It will also come from inside of the organization. But the other thing that will come on the back of this quite soon, I think, will be the requirement around security. Because on one side, you want to encourage self-service, you want to encourage early adopters, you want your organization to be creative and to use technology to be more efficient, to be more effective. But you have to look at more regulation, more control. And certainly one of the things that we think will happen soon is that you're going to have some sort of certification, some sort of validation in terms of data sources. Now, whether that's by a key or whether it's by some sort of authentication or validation, on one side, you want to encourage people to go and grab as much information, which effectively is what products like ChatGPT will do. But as I said, you don't really know what data it's been trained on, and you don't necessarily know where the data was sourced from in terms of the results that you get. But obviously, you know, what you want to be able to do to be effective as an organization, the data that you really want to work on is your data, but that data will obviously be within your domain, within your environment. But if you can complement and you can extend that data through sources of trusted and validated secondary data, then that increases the value of the analysis that you're going to do on that data. And generally speaking, what we find is the more variety, the more variation there is in data, normally the decision making is better. And also when we talk about decision making, it's much better to do things near real time and real time, but obviously in a controlled way that you can validate and you can build rules into the decision making process itself. So this hopefully gives you a little bit of an insight. I'm sure I know everybody's got their own experiences, they've got their own feelings, different companies, some people are more regulated than others. Some organizations have been around for a long time, some organizations are more bureaucratic. But what, again, we're seeing in a lot of companies now is that they're building almost these sort of tiger teams or sort of skunk works. And they're trying to build internally a community of people that will actually collaborate together, typically more often than not outside of work, because it becomes an interest. But this gives you, quite a good base for people to exchange information, to learn, to get ideas, and really start to get their hands on and understanding what the capabilities are and what the limitations are in terms of the technology, but also in terms of what the organization will and won't allow. So as I say, if you're in a highly governed and regulated industry, if you're dealing with sensitive information, etc., obviously there's going to be more controls. But then again, you can have different groups within even regulated companies where you give certain projects or certain initiatives a little bit more flexibility in terms of the tools they can use, the data they can use, but you do it within a sterile environment. It almost becomes a DMZ for AI within the organization itself. So it's interesting. We're seeing a lot of interest. I think this level of interest will increase significantly. But obviously, just looking at this slide, there are some basic requirements. And one of them is, how do you move data? This slide talks about cloud environments, and that's primarily because most of the developments, most of the technologies are very much centered around cloud environments and primarily within public cloud and not necessarily private cloud. So there are limitations, but as I say, it doesn't, even if you have strict needs around data sovereignty, etc., or if you can't trust network connectivity in terms of bandwidth and availability, it doesn't mean to say that all data will go to the cloud. You might want to process certain data for certain business decision making, and particularly if that data is coming from external sources anyway. If you're processing data from the internet, social media, etc., by default, it isn't your data in inverted commas, so there shouldn't be any issue around intellectual property, copyrights, etc., etc., etc. But this is something that will pan out over time. The other question here, it talks about how much of the data is not leveraged. And this is another thing, because from a click-stroke talent perspective, in our definition, data is just ones and zeros, it's binary. But when we look at how data is structured, how it's formatted, how it's modeled, etc., etc., data can be used in many, many different ways. And it comes down to what I tried to say before. It really is, it's a crude asset to the organization, but it's how you use that data in terms of context, in terms of validity, in terms of variety. And people have to think outside of the box now, because it's now possible for pretty much any organization to have almost what data they want at any time from anywhere. It's getting to be that level of availability. But at the same time, as I say, when we look at where organizations traditionally have worked from, most data tended to be structured, and most of the decision making was based on that. But now with generative AI, now we're talking about a completely different data set. We're talking about access to a pool of potential information that by default is almost unlimited. But obviously there's risk in terms of where that data comes from and how it can be used. And these are the challenges that organizations, I think, will, as time goes on, start to resolve. But I think the industry itself will also start to introduce more validation of trusted sources of data. And this is something that has to happen. The other thing to talk about, obviously, is things like regulatory needs. I mean, when we talk about having access to data, you've got to make sure, as I mentioned before, that you have rightful access to the data. It's not something that somebody else's IP or it's been plagiarized from one organization and sold by another. But data is becoming more and more of a commodity, and as a commodity, it will be traded, and quite often it will be traded for some sort of financial exchange. And this whole concept of trust in not just the quality of the data, but trust in the source of the data, and trust in the validity of the data itself. So trust is a word that will come more and more into play when we talk about trusted sources. And from an AI perspective, the other sort of trade-off on that is what they call trusted answers. So you may want to run some NLP script, you may want to run something through an LLM, and you'll get a result back. But part of the problem is, can you trust that answer? How do you know that the information that's come back is the right information? So this is something more and more that will come into play. It isn't just a question of accepting what has been provided as being the right thing. The other thing I would say is that if, when these LLMs are trained and they're trained on limited data sets, then if you have 5 people in 5 different organizations running the same inquiry, then you're probably going to get 5 of the same answer. And is that really creating any value to the organization? And is it really differentiating enough for you to be able to consume it? So I think what's happening now is that everything is up in the air. I think there's a huge opportunity. There are limitations in terms of adoption. One of them I've mentioned is around technology. So one of the downsides of AI at the moment, one of the issues was around connectivity, but I think regardless of what platforms you use for data integration, data quality, et cetera, whether you're using ETL, ELT, these things tend to get addressed. I don't think connection is as complex as it was in the past. But obviously, when we talk about these limitations, then connectivity is one, having access to the platforms that primarily are cloud-based is another. And another consideration is really around the skill in-house, or the skills that need to be developed to actually start to not just understand the technology and deploy the technology, but to be able to use it to business benefit. So skills is something that is, and I see it already in the industry. If you want to put another couple of zeros on your salary, just go on LinkedIn and put AI in every other word, and you'll be the most popular person on the planet. So skills is something that we need to consider. But being a little bit more specific, so when we look at where we are today, the appetite and the demand for data is increasing. So every organization needs more data. And as I say, it's not just data in a structured format, it's data in many formats. We're talking about different types of data. We're talking about data from different locations, more people, but underneath this obviously is more risk as well. It's risk to the organization, and it's risk to the individual people themselves. So it's got to be regulated. It has to be governed in a way. And I think these things will come through more and more now as AI becomes more mainstream. I think you'll see there's more control. Things like GDPR, POPIA, have gone a long way in terms of managing personal identifiable information and confidential information. Obviously, there's lots of things around security with 27001, et cetera. But I think as AI becomes more adopted, then I think there'd be more regulation, there'd be more control, et cetera. So when we talk about data, and this really is talking about why people need more data, but I mean, this isn't exhaustive, and I wouldn't necessarily believe that these are the most important ones. They are to different organizations. But the bottom line is that as data becomes a commodity, it drives everything that the organization does, and it touches every part of the organization. It touches suppliers, it touches customers, it touches employees, it touches stakeholders, it touches just about everybody. It touches the community. So when we talk about outcomes of data, it's something that you have to create. So when we talk about value, you can improve things, and that is something normally that is quite measurable. But this isn't always around getting small gains. Quite often what people are looking for is something that's completely new and innovative that will be a game changer. And normally that comes down to being creative, and it comes down to being bold. And I think what AI will do, it will give a lot of organizations a platform for people that weren't always necessarily identified as being change agents or even being the subject matter experts or having the right authority in an organization to make change. But I think where those people are in organizations now, I think personally, these are the ones that will start to drive the adoption and drive the awareness. And then it becomes hopefully infectious, because normally success breeds success. And when people start to see the benefits, then it makes sense to do more and to turn the volume up. But obviously, success isn't guaranteed, and you learn more through failure. So this is why we think that when we look at how organizations are working now, and not every organization is the same. And when we talk about AI, a lot of companies have been using AI for a long time. If you look at people like Amazon, eBay, etc., these are all masters of it. This isn't anything necessarily new to them, but now it's becoming more commoditized, and now it's becoming more widely accepted and probably more affordable as well. Then I think this is where we're going to see a lot of the changes coming through. But you can draw your own conclusions as to where you in your organization can see the benefits coming through. So just talking about where we are today with data. So remembering this data now isn't always your data. It can be external data, it can be shared data, it can be purchased data. We're seeing more and more growth in the US around data brokers. We're seeing more information exchanges. We're seeing a lot more collaboration of organizations that are prepared to share some of their data for research in exchange for data that they wouldn't necessarily have, as long as it's anonymized. So if you wanted to run an analysis or to run some sort of modeling, if you're doing it on biased data, then the results will be biased. But if you can run that same analysis on a completely independent data set and you get exactly the same results, then I think you've got a higher degree of confidence that this is the likely outcome. But if you run the same analysis on another data set and it gives you completely different answers, then I think you have to go back and analyze that and find out really why there is a difference. So there is some plumbing requirement here in terms of being data driven, in terms of what you need to support AI strategy, AI adoption, etc. So assume that we've got access to all of this data. We can get any data from any place, anytime, anywhere. It can be files, it can be anything. It can be IoT, it can be emails, it can be PowerPoints, it can be anything. And really, how do you map that to the outcome of the business itself? Now, obviously, one of the things, and it always sounds easy, is bringing this information together. So today, there's never really been that many restrictions, particularly if you're working behind your firewalls, etc. You can move data across your LAN, your WAN, etc. You can bring data in from external sources through APIs, in the old days through web services, etc. But now the challenge is becoming bigger, because the demand and the future demand is going to be more around the variety of the data and the velocity of the data as well. Because as you become more data driven and as you trust the data that you have, and you build the decision-making parameters to drive the business itself, then it's going to consume more data. So this is something that will continue to increase. But as I say, one of the key things now is that bringing data in is one thing, but you have to process this data. So the requirements for compute will increase more and more. Obviously, from an ML perspective, you can build your own algorithms, you can deploy your own algorithms, or you can move data out to specialized platforms, to platforms like Databricks, etc., where you can run some of the analytics on other platforms. And it's probably going to be a combination of both. But I think the cloud providers, when we look at what Azure's doing, GCP, AWS, et cetera, I suspect that more and more now this requirement to have local POPs in country will continue, because the demand for compute from AI will continue. And it's going to be more than the sort of traditional edge cloud, which is typically the way that a lot of them have hedged their sort of direct investment in data centers. I think more and more now that the demand for compute will go back to the basics of having more MIPS and flops and CPU and cores, etc., because you're going to need this compute power itself. So connection to data is obviously one thing. Bringing this data together, so having the ability to merge data, to do mashups, to blend data, to be able to look at different types of data, this is something that is becoming more and more critical. Because when you automate your decision-making process, then you have to look at a lot more of the variables and a lot more of the things that could influence and skew some of the decisions that you're making as an organization. So you can't always make business decisions based on fairly simple analysis, which might be something as simple as, I don't know, buying gold at this price and selling at something else. I mean, anyone can do that, and they do it now. But the key thing is not just understanding the trends within the market, but before you commit to a transaction, you just need to validate that if there has been a change in market price, is this a local change? Is it being driven by something that is external to the market? It might be that there's something happening in a part of the world that's driving the price of gold up, and your decision whether to buy or sell might be based on whatever that incident is and how long you think it will go on for. So bringing this data together and making more sense of it in terms of blending the data, in terms of analyzing the data, in terms of trusting the data, is becoming more and more critical. And I think this is something that will continue as organizations become more hungry for data, and as data becomes more available. You do have to have more controls in place to trust it, both in terms of the data itself and also from the sources of the data that you're using. Obviously, analyzing the data is another key consideration. And here, we're talking about, analytics as it sort of is today, whether it's cognitive analytics, etc. But obviously, analyzing it is one thing, but then the whole thing comes down to acting on it. And this is normally where decision making comes in. But obviously, the more you automate, the more checks and balances you need to put in place, because machines are not infallible. Obviously, from a security perspective, you've got internal and external threats that you have to monitor. And it sort of depends on what the stakes are as well. So obviously, if you're running reports, if it's something that is not mission critical or life critical, then you can, in theory, accept a higher degree of risk. But when the stakes are higher, you need to be in a position where you have more validation, you have more trust in the data, and you have more of an insurance policy that says, well, what is the final check before we make this commitment in terms of a business decision. So AI sort of spans all of this. AI is embedded into products and technologies and has been for a while. But the key thing now is that it's more and more available. But the trend and the change that we're seeing is that the traditional way of people that have been using AI in the past has been limited, I think, because the capability of AI and the power of AI has been quite limited as well. But what the industry is doing now, people have dabbled a lot, but when we look at traditional AI, it's been quite limiting. And now the key thing is around generative AI. And here we're talking about personalized answers. Here we're not talking about running a query on a data set that something's been trained on that is quite limited and may not always be relevant to your business. But now when we talk about the power of generative AI, now we're talking about ideally data sets that are your data sets, data that is trusted and validated by you. But obviously what we're looking for are personalized answers. So if you're running your queries through your own AI infrastructure, what you want to be able to do is to get very personalized answers. You need for sure multiple sources of data. And the other thing is that you've got to have much more advanced search capabilities within the LLMs that you have access to. So there's always going to be limitations, but obviously ChatGPT is coming out with a new release. I mean, the guys, different vendors have different views. They're bringing different products to market. Sometimes they're quite proprietary, and this is something that's quite limiting. But you really have to sort of make a decision soon as to whether or not it's something that you will wait for more maturity, whether or not you decide to build a tiger team, whether or not you want to go full commitment and build your AI platforms and start to build the algorithms. But obviously with that comes, issues around the unknown. You never quite know what assurance you have in terms of how successful the development of the platform would be. There's obviously a lack of skills within the marketplace, and this is something I think that is quite limiting. And this quite often inhibits what organizations will do, because quite often if they start to develop people, if they train people, if they skill them up, where there's a market demand, the concern always is, well, those people just get to a point of being useful and then they'll be poached and they go and work somewhere else. So there's always a balance in terms of make and buy from any sort of decision within any organization. So when we look at it, ultimately what we're saying is that these, and this is a sort of click view of the world, but what we're saying is that within any AI platform, as a minimum, you have to be able to think about connecting to any source. This should be something that is assumed is always there. Now we're moving away from batch to near real time to real time. Now we're talking about high velocity data in many cases. Then whatever platform, whatever use case you have, it has to scale. You have to be able to manage large volumes of varied data. The other thing is that it really should be able to be moved to any target. That target can be another platform for analysis. It could be to another application. It could be to a report. It could be to a decision-making process. But the ability to be able to transform all of this data is something that becomes critical, because obviously you're creating value from data, but the value has to be within the execution of the data and the utilization. Governance, security, etc., will always come into it more and more, particularly, as I say, in fairly highly regulated industries, particularly things like lineage, because you need to know from a business perspective where the data came from and where that data is going to. You've got to have controls of it, and those controls have to be strong enough for internal audits and for external audits. As you become more data driven and as people become more trusted consumers of data, you have to be able to build your data catalogs. You have to have glossaries of data so that people know what data is available, etc. From an analytics perspective, obviously, the speed of analysis, you really want more and more governed self-service, because you need to encourage consumption and use of the data. But all of these things that are here are very much driven by AI, either as an embedded technology, but probably more importantly as an enabler of the flow of data, the availability of the data, the processing of the data, and the trust of the data that you will have as an organization. So when we talk about acting on data, I mean, obviously this is quite limited. It talks about reports and alerts, and there's nothing really new there. Automation, obviously you want to automate, but you can't automate unless you've got the right level of control mechanisms in place, etc., etc. And obviously things like collaboration, whether that's internal collaboration, collaboration with suppliers, customers, governments, etc., etc., etc. So this is really all I wanted to sort of talk about, because to try and summarize, what I'm seeing is that obviously technology is coming mostly from the US still, mostly from West Coast. There is a lag. They are very much ahead of the curve because most of the opportunities around AI are going to be linked to cloud, and that cloud will probably be public cloud. Obviously, everyone is jumping on and having to provide AI at whatever level within their platforms or their architectures or their roadmaps, etc., etc. But it's here to stay. It's something that organizations really should start to have a strategy. That strategy might be to build, as I say, a small tiger team or some sort of skunk works to find people that are interested in the technology initially and just to play around with it. Or it might be that you look at it more from a strategic perspective. But obviously, as time goes on, then people's positions will change. There is a skills gap. This is something that is quite limiting. And I think a lot of organizations are relying on people that have an interest in AI, and they're not always necessarily the people that you would think are the right people. I think cloud is obviously a limitation in terms of availability. I think the other thing is that organizations have to look at data as an asset in a different way now. I think you have to look at data, the prediction is that I think it's 80% of the data that will be consumed will be unstructured. So this is a big shift from sort of traditional thoughts and use in the past, where mostly people are using structured data. But this unstructured data is really where you're going to start to differentiate, because this is where you can create more value and more understanding of the dynamics of the business. And I think it's there that you can start to automate, as long as you've got high levels of trust, and that's going to bring certain challenges and opportunities, as I say. And I think the industry will get more regulated as AI starts to continue. But personally speaking, I don't think this is a fad. I think this is something that's here to stay. I think, like everything, it's going to have risk. I think, like everything, you'll probably learn more by mistakes. So don't be put off by that. But certainly at a product and infrastructure level, the key thing is that you've got to have the ability to connect to all of these data sources. Without that, then obviously not a lot happens. But even when you connect to that data, you've got to have the ability to process the data. And when you're processing the data, you've got to have the right algorithms in place to do the sort of inquiries that you want to run, or to make the decisions that the organization wants to automate going forward. So I'm sort of running out of time now. So hopefully you found it a little bit interesting. I've deliberately tried not to talk about any products at all. I think that isn't the objective. I just wanted to give you my sort of spin working at Click and what we're seeing within the industry, but definitely, like everybody else, all of the other software vendors, everyone's having to wake up very, very quickly. Everybody is, focusing on this, and I think this is a changer, but it's not an easy thing for organizations to adopt, as I say, because of skill shortage, because of regulation, because of many, many other reasons, but it's something that will continue. And like this thing around driverless vehicles, it was only a couple of years ago that it really became quite, a topic of conversation, and there was lots and lots of YouTube videos around cars crashing, etc., etc. But it's not gone away. It's continuing, and the technology is maturing, and that technology will continue to develop. And pretty soon this eventually will become the standard. But I think for things like driverless vehicles, they all need to be driverless vehicles, and then it's got a chance of succeeding.
Ryan, thank you very much. I thoroughly enjoyed that presentation, and I really do thank you for your time. If you have a few more minutes, perhaps you can stick around just a little bit longer if you have questions.
Sure,
yeah. I have a question. It's not strictly on AI, but it's on your second component, data management. I am thinking about your role there at Click and Talend, about enterprise sales. You're obviously talking to big corporates. I'm curious to know whether or not the idea of sharing data between your, let's just say, supply chain partners, or your collaborating in your network to try and make things more efficient, whether that trend is increasing. Because I mean, it ought to increase as technology gets better, but I'm wondering if you're noticing whether the people you're talking to are collaborating more and more. So for instance, the suppliers collaborating with a manufacturer, and a manufacturer's collaborating, sharing data with their customers through the supply chain like that. Do you have any views on that?
Yeah, I mean, what I tend to see, it's normally done through a third party. So, and part of it comes down to a degree of anonymization, because obviously you can share data, but you don't necessarily have to say where it came from and who owns it. There's also this concept of exchange. So it's like everything. If you're going to provide something to somebody, then you want something back in return. And that might be data for data. It might be data for information. So the third party could be something as simple as, an analytical platform that says, okay, well, you can run your data through the platform. And it might even be synthetic data that you will also want to model on. So you say, okay, well, let's run some live data and let's run some test data. But I think in the US, this is becoming, and this is my personal view, I'm not saying this is necessarily the way the industry is going, but normally anything from the US, it succeeds because there's money associated with it. So if anyone can make money out of it, they will normally try and make it happen. So this concept of data brokerage and data sharing, I think, is likely to increase, and particularly when we talk about this trusted data thing. Now, on your point around local collaboration, I mean, if people know each other and trust each other, then that goes a long way in terms of the trust component. But obviously, you've got to be careful that, if you're a logistics company, if you're Imperial Logistics and you're sharing data with, I don't know, TNT or something, the organization itself might not be happy about it. So even if you felt it was the right thing to do, you may not get the permissions. And this is another thing, when in the data sharing world, in the ideal situation that you want to be able to share data because it creates value all the way around. But obviously you have to work within your organization. So healthcare is a good example. I mean, hospitals do share clinical information. They do share a lot of information. But when it comes to patient information, then it has to be more regulated and more controlled. So I think it sort of depends on the industry, but personally, I think there'd be more demand for data sharing because data becomes more of a a valued and recognized commodity. Does that answer the question?
Yes, thank you. When you first started, you were talking about anonymized data. I was thinking more about non-anonymized because it's, through the supply chain, you'd actually want to share specific data, but then you answered it thereafter. So that's great. Thank you for that. Are there any questions in the room? If there are questions from the external people, the remote people, please just type it in the chat or just unmute yourself and just fire away.
Just while people are thinking, I just give you an example, I think, of data sharing in South Africa. So there's a lot of trucks that travel around from different provinces, etc. But most of the big trucks have a CAN bus in there where, if you're a Mercedes or MAN or whatever the vehicle manufacturer is, there's a lot of telemetry information that gets captured from these vehicles. But obviously through it, there's other information that you can collect. Now, again, this is an example where, Mercedes or whoever, or someone that's licensed to harvest this data from the vehicles themselves, can structure the data into something that becomes more commoditized and more valuable to other people. And that can improve the performance and the efficiency of distribution and logistics. So, it just came to mind because it was a project that we worked on recently, and I was quite surprised how well the CAN bus can collect data on vehicles and how the telemetry and that information can be moved vast distances, but that data can be valuable to all sorts of people, including highway planning, including people like ShopRite and Pick and Pay themselves, because they may want more information on where their products and goods are.
Yeah, good point. You have a question?
I can just make a general comment on those lines. I'm not directly involved in this project, so I can't give you the nitty-gritty detail, but this supply chain company, and we're busy integrating with some of our bigger players digitally in a structured format, plus orders and invoices between us and them, so we can get the data more accurately, pay invoices faster, know better what is in the pipeline and the expected ETAs, and we are putting that in our adjudication for if we buy from them or not. So it's true what you say, both parties.
That makes sense.
Yeah, and I think, the other thing, again, it can come down to fraud as well, because, where you've got signed documents, and I'm just talking off the top of my head here, but, obviously you can monitor the matching of a signature. I'm not saying you would do it on every transaction, but obviously if you see a situation that is suspicious, or if you wanted to do an audit or a trace on something, and normally it's looking for a needle in a haystack. So quite often, you'll probably have to monitor and read the signature on every PDF, but it's not beyond the realms of reality now to do that en masse and to really look and see whether or not there is a change in the signature. So it's just little things like that. But again, this may be a benefit to the company, or it might be a service that an organization would want to provide to any organization to say that we can do validation, of signatures or visual validation, etc., etc. But I think what it comes down to is that when you think about it, in theory, there's no boundaries now. And I think the challenge that you have as organizations is really where where the most business benefit will come from, because what you want to avoid is putting a lot of effort and consuming a lot of brain cells into something that is very challenging, but the business benefit is not that great. Whereas if you identify the projects and the priorities that are key to the organization, I think you have to review, your wish list as an organization now with a new hat on that says, well, there's no limitations. We can get pretty much any data and we can process a lot of data. We don't have to be scared by it. And by the way, we can create a lot more innovation in terms of how we transact and how we conduct our business, because there's less limitation now in terms of what people can do. Because if you can automate it in such a way that it becomes almost no overhead to the organization, then this is something to me that becomes a priority. But obviously the other side of all of this, and we've not talked on it, is the idea of dark data or fake data, etc., etc. But also the other thing, and I had it quite recently, is that it's the impact at a social level, because as you automate and as you take away more mundane tasks, then you'll lose jobs. And the problem you have there is that you have to reskill people, or you lose people. So this is going to be interesting, as I say, because more and more now I'm seeing there'd be more demand for university courses, there'd be more demand for organizations to run educational sessions on AI to teach people how to write algorithms, etc., etc. This is something that I'm sure will increase substantially now, because I do believe it's reality.
Agreed. All right, so I'm just looking at the time, so I'm conscious of that. Are there any questions? Last chance. I had a question, but I think I'll keep it. Brian, thank you very, very much. I certainly really enjoyed your insights, your knowledge and experience. So thank you for sharing that with us. Thank you for those who joined remotely, and thank you for those who came in person. Stefan had to leave early because he's part of a deployment team that was meeting at 6. But ordinarily, I would thank Intellect for hosting and providing the pizzas. But there's no one from Intellect in the room. But nonetheless, thank you, Intellect. Yeah. All right. And thank you again, everyone, for joining. And I wish you a wonderful rest of your evening.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Bye-bye. Thank you again, Brian. Okay, now I need to end this one.